We're in Exodus chapter 10 today, and these chapter divisions are not made along the lines of the divisions that are in the text. So briefly, let's just review the fact that the first 9 plagues are set out in 3 cycles of 3 each. And we're now in the 3rd cycle, which is the most intense. And in the 3rd cycle, page 23 of your notes, we find that Moses is directly bringing these things upon Egypt using the staff of God. So they're God's judgments. The first 3 were brought by Aaron, the second 3 by Moses, and the third 3 by God himself. And these are no longer warning signs. The destruction of Egypt is actually going to be accomplished by these last 3 plagues and then sealed by the 10th, which is of a different nature altogether, because it's against person rather than against the world. These judgments come from God, and so they don't arise from the ground and the waters of the ground, but instead fall from above. That's different from the plagues of the first 2 cycles, where the Nile River is judged, and then the frogs come out of the Nile, and the gnats come out of the ground, or the second cycle, where the bugs come out of the ground or are associated with it, and so forth. Here, it's obvious that they come from above. God is bringing these. And the climax of the first cycle of plagues, the magicians were defeated. The second cycle of plagues, the magicians were driven out. And the climax of the 3rd cycle of plagues here is that Moses is driven out. So last time we looked at the first of these last 3 plagues, which is the plague of hail. It's in chapter 9, verses 13 to the end. And we saw Pharaoh do some repenting here. Verse 27 of chapter 9 of Exodus. I have sinned this time, but Yahweh is the righteous one. I and my people are the wicked ones. There's some beginning awareness on the part of Pharaoh that he is a sinner, that he has angered a God who is not just some piece of fiction, but a real God. Verse 28 makes supplication to Yahweh, for there's been enough of God's thunder and hail. He associates the true God, the ultimate God, with the God of the Hebrews. So Pharaoh's beginning to figure out what's going on. When he's being smitten, his heart is soft. But as soon as God removes the plague, then Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he won't let the people go. So now we come to chapter 10, where we are today. Third from the last plague altogether. Plague number 8, the plague of locusts. This is the 2nd plague in the cycle. So instead of saying go to Pharaoh in the morning, it says go to Pharaoh. Chapter 10, verse 1. Then the Lord, Yahweh, said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that I may put these signs in his midst, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. And Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may serve me. And remember, that demand is repeated many times. Let my people go that they may be my slaves. And the issue is, who's slaves to these people? Now, in this case, we're going to find some legal arguments start to come up. Arguments over the treatment of slaves. And arguments that the Bible in biblical law explains the legality of to us. And so we'll be looking at these. So now this phrase has been repeated so many times before, and we looked at that. Let my people go that they may be my slaves is going to take on even more importance in this section that we're looking at today. Notice that God says he's going to make a mockery of the Egyptians. Remember Psalm 2 says, He that sits in the heavens laughs. And Proverbs chapter 1 says, I will laugh at the day of your distress, because you laughed at my word. So that's a frightening thought, but it's one we have to bow the knee to. The Bible does say that there comes a point at which God mocks the wicked as he destroys them. And that's going to happen here because the Egyptians did not repent. Verse 4 says of Exodus 10, If you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. Now, locusts were a great threat to any nation in the ancient world. A locust can eat its weight in vegetation every day. And if a swarm of locusts goes through, they eat everything. And remember that we're judging the gods of Egypt, and the Egyptian farmers had made a god of the locusts and would pray to him and ask him not to send his armies against them. And so there's a judgment here against the locust god. who is unable to protect them from his own armies of locusts. God will bring the locusts into the land. Verse 5, they shall cover the eye of the land. That's literally what it says. It will cover the eye of the land, so no one will be able to see the land. In Hebrew, the word for surface of water, surface of the land, is the same as the word for eye. The moisture and the flatness of the eye is associated with the flatness of the land or the moisture of a spring or a well. So the same word is used, and there's something of a pun here in this verse, you see, that we don't pick up in English. They will cover the eye of the land so that no one will be able to see the land. Well, that's what a real plague of locusts does. You can't even see anything. Now, if that's true, that means that the land is dark. And we're moving in toward the plague of darkness, which is the next one. If a huge cloud of locusts comes in and covers everything, it darkens everything. So we've had tremendous hailstorm with dark clouds darkening the land of Egypt. Now we have locusts everywhere darkening the land of Egypt so you can't even see it. And next we're going to have a plague of darkness that can be felt. So as you can see how in so many ways these plagues are cumulative. They're worse, each one, and they move in certain directions. They get worse and worse. The judgments move higher and higher, starting with the judgment against the Nile, winding up with the judgment against the sun. The situation gets darker and darker as we go. It's very dramatic. So now it says you won't even be able to see the land because of the locusts. Verse 5, they shall also eat the rest of what has escaped, what was left over to you from the hail. And they shall eat every tree that sprouts for you out of the field. The hail destroyed a lot of the crops, didn't do so much damage to the trees. Trees are tougher. The locusts will get all the rest of the crops, and they'll get the trees too. Remember in Genesis chapter 1, the two kinds of plants that attention are called to are trees that bear fruit and crops that bear seed. Those are the two kinds of vegetation that God makes in Genesis chapter 1. It doesn't say anything about broccoli and stuff like that. It just says, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, grain plants, and fruit. Those are the things that attention are called to in Genesis 1, bread and wine. And here, both of those things are destroyed as the cosmos of Egypt is reduced and destroyed and returned to chaos. Verse 6, then your houses shall be filled, and the houses of all your servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians, something that neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen from the day they came upon the land until this day. In other words, ever since the Tower of Babel, when all you people moved down here and scattered out and settled in the land of Mizraim. Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. It means the two Egypts. It's a dual word, ayim. Two Egypts, Upper and Lower Egypt. And frequently there were two different pharaohs. And ever since your people came into this area and created the kingdom of the two Egypts, Mizraim, they've never had so many locusts that locusts would fill up your houses. This is really nasty situation. Not only are they eating up all the vegetation, but there's so many that they just swarm into your house. You know, locusts are big. It's like mice being on you. It's gross. You can eat them, of course. Eat those locusts. John the Baptist did. But it's really a defiling situation. The houses, all the houses, the palaces, are defiled by these things coming in and being all over the people and being all over everything. Now, it's interesting in verse 7 what happens. We begin to see the collapse of Egypt coming about here. Pharaoh's servant said to him, the plague hasn't come yet. How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the men go that they may serve the Lord their God. Don't you realize that Egypt is destroyed? So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, go, become a slave of Yahweh your God. Now see what's happened here? This is now the 8th plague. And the servants of Pharaoh have begun to figure out, based on the first 7 plagues, and then the preliminary crocodile miracle, where Aaron's crocodile ate up the crocodiles of the Egyptians, they begun to realize that this is real. And if locusts are going to come, maybe we ought to head this off. They at least have begun to fear Yahweh. And so Moses and Aaron say, all right, locusts are coming, and they leave. And as soon as they're out of the room, Pharaoh's chief counselors, his cupbearer and his baker, and all the other officials of his court, Secretary of Agriculture, say to him, this is probably for real, Pharaoh. There's no reason to think locusts aren't going to come since everything else has come to pass. Let the people go, or there will be nothing left of the land. So Pharaoh calls them back in, and he says they can go. As you know, he tells them a bunch of times they can go, and the language here is precise. Verse 8, go serve Yahweh your God. And that's the issue, who's slaves of the Hebrews? And now for the first time, Pharaoh says, go and be Yahweh's slaves. All right, you're not my slaves anymore. You can go. And then he says, and who are the ones who are going? In verse 9, Moses answers, we shall go with our young and our old. In other words, those who are retired, as well as those who are too young to be in the work, with our sons and our daughters, with our flocks and our herds, flocks of sheep, herds of cattle, for we must have a feast to Yahweh. And then Pharaoh said to them, thus may Yahweh be with you, if ever I let you and your little ones go, take heed, for evil is in your mind. Not so. Go now, the men, and serve Yahweh, for that's what you desire. So they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Now Pharaoh loses his temper here, which is unfortunate for his people, because now they're going to be out by law. But he won't let the wives and the children go. Now, this is not just an emotional situation here. This has to do with a legal claim. And if you'll look at Exodus 21, you'll see the background for it. Now, Exodus 21 is God's revelation of the laws that come several months after this. Now, we'll discuss why Pharaoh would have known about this anyway. Exodus 21, and we'll just start at the beginning. Now, these are the ordinances that you're to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. But on the 7th, that's in the Sabbath year, he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out by himself. If he is the lord of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. Now what's Pharaoh saying when he says the men can go, but the wives and the children have to stay? He is saying that he is the one who has provided the wives to the Hebrews. And so only the men go out, and he will keep the wives and the children. Now, imagine that you're in this situation. Now, when we get to the laws, we'll try to understand the rationale for this. You've sold yourself into slavery because you have no money to pay off your debts. Slavery is only going to last till the Sabbath year when the debts are canceled. And so this is not a terribly bad situation. It's just a matter of indenturing yourself to pay off debts. And while you're there, you meet this beautiful slave girl who works for the master, and so you want to marry her. Now you have a choice. You can wait till you're free, save up money, and buy her out of slavery and marry her, or you can go ahead and marry her, and the master gives her. Now when you go free and you don't have anything to live with, your wife stays back as part of the household of the master until you have enough money to buy her. And that's as much as anything else for her own protection. According to the Bible, she's still your wife. According to the Bible, you still come visit her whenever you want and have children, but she is part of the household of the master until the master is paid what he's owed for her to become free. That's not as barbarous a situation as you might imagine if you fill it out and think about the whole cultural and social situation, which we'll do when we get to it later on. Now notice what Pharaoh does by this. He claims that he's the one who's provided the wife, and therefore the children, to these Hebrew men. And by doing that, he's keeping a hold on them, because those men are not going to go out to have a festival and then head on out into the wilderness and go to the promised land, not if their wives and children are still back there. So they'll be wanting to come back. But that isn't true, is it? When Jacob came down into Egypt, was it just men? And they married a bunch of Egyptian women? No. Their wives came with them. So it's not the case legally that Pharaoh provided the wives. Legally, it's the case where the wife came with the husband into bondage. And so Pharaoh's legal case is wrong. Now, I stress this legality for a reason. There has been, until recently at least, a kind of theology called liberation theology that says God goes to war with the tyrants of the world and beats them up and sets people free. And it doesn't have anything to do with what's right and wrong or lawful or not lawful. It just has to do with oppression. Well, that's not so in the Bible. In the Bible, political freedom is always on a legal basis. And so there are legal arguments here throughout this section. Who owns these slaves? How do you treat slaves under God's law? The Exodus is not a power deliverance where God says, I'm tired of these people being slaves, I'm going to beat up Pharaoh and take them free. It's a legal deliverance where he says, you have no legal claim on these people, they're mine, and we will argue the legality as we go. So this is actually a legal argument here. Go and be the slaves of Yahweh your God. Who's going to go? Well, everybody's going to go, says Moses, because everybody came. Pharaoh says, no, I won't let the women and the children go. So, have had another plague. Verse 12, Exodus 10. Then the Lord, Yahweh, said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts. And remember, we've seen from comparing passages last time that this in the hand is God's staff. So this is going to be God's judgment. Stretch out your hand with the staff of God in it, so to speak, over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come up on the land of Egypt and eat every plant of the land, even everything that the hail has left. So the water plague was the hail, and now the land plague is the locust, and the atmosphere plague will be the darkness. Verse 13, Moses stretched out the staff, his staff over the land of Egypt. And the Lord directed an east wind on the land all that day and all the night, and when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. Now, there's two things that are done with that. One, I think, that's wrong and one that's right. We're told that the east wind is just an expression for a fierce wind, and the wind really came from the south, from the Sudan. But I don't think that's true. I think this meant the wind came from the east. Now, let's see if you can figure out why the wind came from the east. Here are the people in the land of Goshen. When the wind comes from the east, where is it coming from? It's coming from the promised land, which is where God is. Later on in the Bible we find in, I think it's Exodus 15, it's other passages, but it talks about the Lord marched from the east, and he marched from Seir to meet the people at Mount Sinai. And the picture in the Bible is that God comes from the east as if he already has something of a throne here. He already has a throne sitting here, and he marches to the east in order to deliver the people and bring them back into the promised land. And I think that's why it says an east wind. I think it means the wind comes from God. Did God already have a throne city marked out in the promised land? What? What was the throne city that was already marked out? And how do you know that it was marked out? How did David know that Jerusalem was supposed to be the place for the throne? Because Melchizedek was there. And the Psalm says David is the priest after the order of Melchizedek, or that God is. Melchizedek, the king of Salem who brought out bread and wine, there's an implication there that that's already God's throne. And so when they come to the promised land, the city that they want to conquer is Jerusalem, but they can't hold it. And David conquers it and puts the throne there. But already by implication you can see the shadow of it, that this is already a place that's been marked out. So the east wind comes from here. God marches. When we get to Mount Sinai, we'll find God coming from the east to show up to meet the people who are coming from the west. So I think that's why it's an east wind. It's the wind of the Spirit that proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Spirit who blows out from God's throne in the east. Nope, after 1870 there's no special means of the place. The only sacred geography in the New Testament is where God's people meet. We're the sacred geography now. When we come together, that's a holy place because Christ is in the midst. You see, it's God in the midst that makes a place special or holy. In the Old Testament, that's why this was special or holy, because God's throne was there. In the New Testament, Christ is in heaven and in our hearts, and that's what you have. And of course, throughout too much of the Middle Ages, this was holy land. We had to fight for it. Many abuses came about, and for too many people today, it's holy land, and all kinds of political abuses come about as a result of it. And it isn't. It's just a place like any other place. Let's continue. Verse 13, the east wind comes and brings the locust. God brings the locust. The Spirit brings the locust, the wind of the Spirit. Verse 14 says, the locust came up over all the land of Egypt and settled in all the territory of Egypt. And they were very heavy, very numerous, your Bible may say, very heavy. There had never been so many locusts like them before, nor would there ever be so many again. This is your ultimate locust plague of all history. They covered the whole surface of the land, so the land was darkened. It is explicitly made this darkening theme. The darkening of the sky with hail, the darkening of the land here, and then soon the darkening of the sun. They ate every plant of the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Thus nothing green was left on the tree or the plant of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. Remember, the tree and the plant, those are the two categories in Genesis 1. The land of Egypt is being decreated. It's being returned to formlessness and void. And then verse 16 says, Pharaoh hurriedly called to Moses and Aaron and said, I've sinned against Yahweh your God, and against you. This is new. Last time he said, I've sinned against this Yahweh. Now he says, I've sinned against Yahweh and against you. Man, he says, I'll pile this language up, anything to get rid of these locusts. Now therefore, please forgive my sin only this once. Make supplication to Yahweh your God that he would remove this death from me. Now the word death comes into play. This is, I think, the first time it has. We're mounting up toward the death of the firstborn, the death of Egypt. And he, that is Moses, verse 18, went out from Pharaoh and made supplication to Yahweh. So Yahweh shifted the wind to a very strong west wind, which took up the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. And not one locust was left in all the territory of Egypt. But Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he didn't let the sons of Israel go. So, it's amazing, isn't it? That when God lets us go, our hearts get hard. When he grabs hold of Pharaoh, Pharaoh gets soft. Oh, I've sinned. Pray for me. When he lets Pharaoh go, Pharaoh gets hard. That's what we're like. So we come to the last plague against the world before we come into the plague against Adam, the plague against his firstborn sons. And this is the ninth plague, the plague of darkness. There's no warning because it's the third plague in the cycle. It's a judgment against the other primary god of Egypt. Two primary gods were the Nile. Well, three primary gods were the Nile, the sun, and Pharaoh. And the primary plagues are against the Nile, the sun, and the firstborn. Well, here it is. We start with the Nile, we end with the sun. Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis, the city of the sun, because he'd converted. Now it's the other way around. The sun is going to be put out. Verse 21, Then Yahweh said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward the sky, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even a darkness that may be felt. The New Testament speaks of being cast into the outer darkness. And of course, in fulfillment of this, just before the firstborn son died on Calvary, there was darkness for 3 hours. Here we have darkness for 3 days. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. Well, you can't see anything, so all you can do is stay in bed. Grope around, try to find some food and water. But all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. Now, I don't know exactly if this means that it was dark outside for the Israelites and only light in their house. I'm inclined to think it was only light in their house because, you see, we're moving into the idea that the houses of the Israelites are little cities of refuge. In the next plague, remember, it's the house that's marked out with the blood, and if you're in the house, you're safe. And I think that this is by anticipation, that in the houses of the Israelites, if they put up a candle, it gave light in the room. But in the houses of the Egyptians, if they put up a candle, you couldn't see it if you moved it away from your face because the darkness was mysteriously thick. There was black air. Judgment on the air. Remember, don't make any idols of anything in the waters beneath the earth. The earth itself is not making the idols of anything in heaven above, earth beneath, or waters under the earth. And these plagues, each cycle strikes at each of the 3 zones of idols. And now we have thick, dark air. It doesn't say it's ashes from a volcano or something. It doesn't say they couldn't breathe. Just strange, dark air. I don't know if you ever think about it or not, but I mean, we can see each other in this room because air is transparent. What if air wasn't transparent? Some water is clear and you can see through it, but you can put chemicals into water and make it black or colored to where you can't see through it. Glass is clear and you can see through it, but some minerals, I mean, if you held a rock up here, you couldn't see through it, unless it was glass, and then you could see through it. Now, we don't think about atmosphere this way. You know, if you put a bunch of smoke in a room, then you can't see either, but then that's smoky. But just the air itself is clear. But what if air wasn't clear? What if air was opaque and you couldn't see anything? That seems to be what's happening here. The air became opaque. They couldn't see anything. If you can't see, you can't do anything. But there was light in the dwellings of the sons of Israel. And, this is a gracious thing. Word of this is going to get around to the Egyptians. Why is this so gracious? About a week from now, the word's going to go out to the Egyptians. All your firstborn sons are going to die unless you get into a dwelling that's marked out by blood. Well, now, the preceding plague, they learned that the dwellings that God favors had light in them. This is a sign, you see, a gracious sign to the Egyptians that if they learn from it, and many did, that's where this mixed multitude comes from. If they learn from it, they can apply it to the next plague. So it's gracious. Gracious not just to the Israelites, but gracious to the Egyptians. Maybe next time they'll heed the warning to get into a house. And remember, we had this earlier too. When the hail came, they said, take your livestock and put it in shelter before the hail comes. And those who listened to Moses did that, and those who didn't lost their livestock. In just a few days, God is going to say, get into a dwelling. By now, any Egyptian with any sense knows that God means business is going to do that and put himself under the blood. So all of this is gracious. There's always grace in judgment until you're dead. When you're dead, there's no more grace if it comes in the place of judgment. Well, now, verse 24 says, Pharaoh called for Moses and said, go and serve Yahweh. Be his slave. Now he's commanding them a second time, go and be his slaves. Only let your flocks and your herds be detained. Even your little ones may go with you. But Moses said, you must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice them to the Lord our God. Or literally it says, in the margin, you must also give into our hand sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may make them to the Lord our God. And that's important language. Therefore our livestock too will go with us. Not a hoof will be left behind, for we shall take some of them to serve Yahweh our God. And until we arrive there, we don't know with what we will serve Yahweh. We don't know how many of them we'll need, so we're going to take them all. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Now, is this a legal argument? Yes, it is. Look at Deuteronomy 15, and we'll see another aspect of the laws for releasing slaves. How you're supposed to treat Hebrew slaves, and these were Hebrew slaves. Deuteronomy 15, verse 12. If your brother, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year, the Sabbath year, you'll set him free. And when you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock, and from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. You give him threshing floor stuff, which is bread, and you give him wine. Bread and wine, and flocks. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. So the rule for releasing slaves is, you got to give them some gifts when you let them go. And Moses really has two arguments with Pharaoh. The first one is, hey, you didn't give us these flocks. We brought them with us when we came here. Don't you remember we were given the whole land of Goshen to live in? Don't you remember why we were given the land of Goshen? It's because we were shepherds, and shepherding is an abomination to the Egyptians. And so Joseph and Pharaoh gave us and our flocks the land of Goshen. We came with our flocks and our herds, and we're going to leave with our flocks and our herds. But then he also says, you must give into our hand things. Why? Because when a slave is set free, you're supposed to give him gifts. You know, they did this in New England. When people would become indentured servants to come over here, somebody would pay their way. And the way they'd pay it back was by being an indentured servant for 6 or 7 years, or a certain number of years according to a contract. And then when the indentured servitude was over, they would have a party, and they would give them some wine, because they didn't have a hang about that in New England. And they would give them some food, and they would set them up in business. You'd give them some capital to help the guy get set up in business. That's what you do when you set a slave free or an indentured servant. So we didn't do this in the Old South, so we had a war. But in the Bible, when you set your slave free, you're supposed to try to help him get started in business. You know, if he goes out and he's got nothing, he's going to be a slave again a week later. So you give him some stuff to help him get going in business. If he's a really good blacksmith, then instead of giving him some flock, we'll give him some blacksmith equipment to help him get going. That's the idea. That's what they did in New England when people came over here as indentured servants. And that's what they were supposed to do in Israel. And that's what Pharaoh was supposed to do, and Pharaoh didn't want to do it. It's legal. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's something God has written into the hearts of man to know you're supposed to do. Now we come to verses 28 and 29, which really should be in chapter 11. We're going to have chapters, and of course remember the chapters and the verses were not here until a few centuries ago. But the better chapter break would be at verse 28. Then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me, and beware, and do not see my face again. For in the day you see my face, you shall die." And Moses said, "You're right. I shall never see your face again." Now, it would seem that that's the end of the conversation, but if you'll glance down at chapter 11, verse 8, you'll find Moses has some more things to say to Pharaoh, and at the end of verse 8 of chapter 11 it says, "He went out from Pharaoh in hot anger." So really this conversation continues on. Now we have a parenthesis. If you want to mark your Bible, put verses 1 to 3, beginning of verse 1 to the end of verse 3 of chapter 11 is a parenthesis that sets us up for what's going to happen. Before we do that, let me raise a question that I should have discussed just a minute ago. Was Pharaoh obligated to treat Israel as a special people and give them special consideration according to God's law? What he knew? The answer is yes. Genesis 12, verse 3, God said to Abraham, "Those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse." The Egyptians were tremendously blessed when they blessed Joseph and Jacob and gave them gifts. Then their nation was blessed. And now, when they judged Israel, now they're being judged. When they cursed Israel, now they're being cursed. Pharaoh knows this. The Egyptian culture was trained in all of this knowledge. They knew all about what's in the book of Genesis. Joseph had had influence at court for 30, 40, 50 years. They thoroughly knew all this. This is all in their background. Pharaoh knows this. He knows the story of the book of Genesis. He's heard all this before. He knows he's supposed to treat the Hebrews as special, and he's not doing it. So he was obligated to. He's not acting out of ignorance. We can't feel sorry for Pharaoh and say, well, you know, this guy didn't know all this stuff. He didn't have the Bible. Yes, he did. He had as much of the Bible as the Jews had, and he knew about it. Also, Genesis 17, verse 4, God prophesies to Abraham, "You will be a father of many nations." And that's seen in Genesis 45, verse 8, when Joseph says, "God has made me a father to Pharaoh." So that at that point in history, the Hebrews exercised this spiritual fatherhood over the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh knew that he was supposed to respect the Hebrews as a special priestly people, and he would have known how to treat them. Could Pharaoh have known these laws in Deuteronomy and Exodus that we've looked at that came later on? Would they have been part of the common law of the ancient Near East? I believe the answer to that is yes. A certain amount of common sense tells you that if a man brings his wife into slavery with him, she goes out with him. If he brings flocks with him, they go out with him. A certain amount of sanctified common sense tells you that you should give gifts to a slave when you set him free. But beyond that, and we won't do it, if we were to look back at how Jacob and Laban interacted with each other, we found the same principles. Jacob worked for Laban for 6 years. Jacob took out with him all the flocks that Laban had given him. Laban tried to steal them back, and God met Laban in the night and said, "I'll kill you if you don't leave Jacob alone." So Laban left Jacob alone. Laban tried to steal the wives back, said, "These are my daughters." And God met him and said, "You better not. They're Jacob's daughters." Now, that's information that's in Genesis. Joseph knew it. Joseph taught it to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh knew it. This is part of the legacy of the Egyptian culture. Just as we know about the things that have happened in our past, they knew about what had happened in theirs. And so the Pharaoh knew these principles, and he is self-consciously setting himself at odds with known, revealed truth. But we're not holding Pharaoh's feet to the fire for something he couldn't know about. Having said that, the bell has rung. And so we won't do chapter 11 today. We'll pick it up here next week. We'll do chapters 11 and 12. Let's close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you have worked out our salvation on a legal basis, that we can have confidence that everything that was done to set us free was done right, as Jesus Christ obeyed your law and set us free. We ask that as we think about these things more in the weeks to come, you'd reveal more to us about them. Now help us to prepare our hearts for worship. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.